Hello, everybody. Sabah al-khair al-jamii' ومساء الخير in the Arab world. I'm so excited to have my comrade Rania Khalek on with me. Before we get started, folks, this is streaming on Psychic Militancy and East is a podcast. So if folks on East is a podcast has not yet subscribed to Psychic Militancy, make sure you do that. Please press like, share it with your comrades. There are folks who know we're on live. There are folks who might not. This is going to be an awesome conversation. I already know it. Rania and I could talk, the paint off of a wall, I think, at this point between the both of us. So if you haven't yet told your friends or anybody that we're having this conversation live, I don't think there's any space we're not going to go into. It's called What the Fucking Empire, because that's what we're here to talk about. All the fucking shit that we're inundated by. And just as a reminder, Psychic Militancy, really part of what I wanted to do with Psychic Militancy is be able to have these public facing conversations. We know the pressures upon us to fall into despair, to fall into confusion, to really feel like everything has been lost, to feel like our struggles don't mean anything. And that's part of what we're here to say. No, fuck that. We're here. We're going to have this conversation. We're going to be focused. So let me just introduce Rania quickly. She might not need an introduction to folks, but I want to give her props. Rania Khalek is a journalist for Breakthrough News, where she hosts the show Dispatches. Make sure you check that out. Subscribe to it. She invited me, I think last year, right? I had an amazing conversation.
One of our best episodes.
You're so sweet. You're so sweet. Yeah, we talked about why we don't diagnose Zionism, because it's an ideology and not a pathology and needs to be disrupted. She also co-hosts the weekly Freedom Side live stream with Eugene Puryear, and who's also awesome. So just make sure you check that out. Rania, halafiki.
It's so good to be on with you. I'm so honored. I'm so honored to get to have a conversation with you. And also, I need to tell you, my family loves you so much. And my sister, one of my sisters in particular, was like, "Will you tell her I said hi?" So Rola says hi.
Hi, Rola. It's so good to see. Yeah, this is great. So Rania and I discovered this past summer in Lebanon that our villages actually are very close to each other. So this is one of the things that you end up getting when you're like Lebanese and also anti-imperialist, is that we like kind of run in these circles, but we found out that we actually live very close to each other and have overlaps.
Yeah, right? No, it's so cool. It's like Lebanon's such a small country, so I feel like it's one of those places where if we don't know each other, like our parents can like figure out who knows who, how, and where, but also to like be ardent anti-imperialists and also so near each other is very exciting, because it feels a little rare these days, which I know we're going to talk about.
Absolutely. Anti-imperialist, anti-sectarian, anti-Zionist, like this is all the shit. So Rania's beaming in from Lebanon. So yeah, hala, I wish I were there with you. My heart's in Beirut always, as you know. But that's kind of where I wanted to start. So one of the things, we're going to talk about Lebanon. We want to talk about Cuba. We want to talk about all the things that empire is fucking up. But one of the things I want to ask you about, since you're in Lebanon, you're kind of ears to the ground. I love your analysis. What's up with the fucking normalization talk? I mean, here's the thing. We're used to fascists everywhere, and especially in Lebanon, being very cavalier about normalization. Although I have to say, even fascists like Jaja and the rest of his ilk kind of treaded lightly, right? When they were talking, it was never, we knew what their shtick was, but the bold-faced, like, yes, let's just do it. Why wouldn't we talk to Israel? Why wouldn't we normalize with the state, with the Zionist state? That was kind of in their circles. I feel like even talking about it, even just being okay, saying this is a possibility, has become more regularized. Like, what's your sense of things? What's happening on the ground? What do folks need to know? Give us the demo.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, look back, not too long ago, like you said, even if there were people who aspired to some sort of normalization with the Israelis, they were very careful about how they framed it and when they said that, because it was so unacceptable to have that opinion. But things have definitely changed. I would say the shift occurred after October 2024, when there was the massive escalation, the big war between Lebanon and Israel. And this war was really destructive. It was more destructive than past wars because you had the Israelis just, dropping 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs all over Beirut, even outside of the sort of zones we're used to the Israelis bombing. And this was during the genocide in Gaza, where the red lines, if there ever were any, which there still were some red lines, give or take, didn't exist anymore for the Israelis, right? So you had the Israelis bombing places we never thought they'd bomb, that went far beyond the south, all the way up into the north. And it just, nobody felt safe. And this also came after years of disaster in Lebanon, right? You had the economic collapse in 2019. You had the port explosion in 2020. The economy continued to collapse after, and you had massive hyperinflation. And people's livelihoods have changed pretty dramatically in Lebanon. The sort of conveniences that we used to have in this country don't exist as much anymore. It's much, more difficult to get 24-hour electricity than, maybe it used to be if you were able to even afford it. So I guess the quality of life in Lebanon has gone down. People have left the country, and, Lebanon always has waves of people leaving for work, but this was another massive wave. And so, I mean, this I think culminates into what we're seeing now, which is also a feeling of triumph by the anti-resistance side in Lebanese politics, and regionally, actually, because they look at October, November 2024, and they see that as defeat for Hezbollah, and a defeat for the axis of resistance. And they see, defeat for Iran, defeat for Hamas. And I'm talking about the locals in this region who are anti-resistance and align with the US and the fascists, what have you. And so these people, because they feel like they're triumphant, they feel much more comfortable having or, putting out this rhetoric that's very clear about their desire to normalize with Israel, because they don't feel there's as much of a consequence. They feel like Hezbollah is weaker. Hezbollah is weaker, but they're not weak. So it's a bit, I think, wrong for them to think of things like that or in that way. And I think there's also something happening where even people who are maybe lean pro-resistance, maybe not, they're not like from the base of people who are in the resistance camp, but lean pro-resistance and are in their hearts and minds anti-Israel. Even from those kinds of people, there's been a really successful, I think, media campaign over the past several years in Lebanon. And Lebanon has a lot of media outlets. Many of them are funded by right-wing oligarchs connected to the Gulf states or explicitly funded by the Gulf states. And these media outlets have done a really good job of putting out a narrative that blames every single inconvenience in Lebanon on Hezbollah's weapons. So you don't have electricity because Hezbollah has weapons. You don't have your money anymore. You lost it in the banking collapse because of Hezbollah's weapons. This is not true. This is not true. These are the results of other things happening inside Lebanon, not the result of Hezbollah's weapons. But
it couldn't be that the Zionist state has bombed every single power plant for the past, decades, infrastructure, oligarchs, warlords, stealing the fucking money. None of that.
All the things. No, none of that. It's because there's a group of people who have weapons to try to deter or even fight the Israelis sometimes. They've done a really good job of linking these two things in people's minds so that even though it's not true, you hear something enough times, you start to believe it. And so that's happening at the same time. There's also, I think, exhaustion. People are just tired. And so they're tired and they think, you know what? We just let it be. Like, we hate Israel. We hate Zionism. We hate what they're doing to Palestinians, but not really our problem. The only reason we have a problem is because we haven't normalized with Israel. And if we do, we can be more successful. We can be like Dubai, which also isn't true, because you look at countries that have normalized with Israel. You look at Egypt. You look at Jordan. The unemployment rate in those countries is so high. The economies suck. I mean, they're basically just police states that have no space for any politics outside of, whatever the dear leader wants. And they are complicit in the genocide in Gaza. And life kind of sucks in those places in many ways. So being friends with Israel doesn't make it better. Maybe it makes you less likely to get bombed. So I'm not saying I don't understand where that sentiment comes, but you have all these things happening at the same time to lead to this, conversation in public, like you're talking about, in a way that's scary, that we're not used to hearing in a place like Lebanon. But, on a more positive side, I do want to say there was a poll that was done recently by the Arab Opinion Index, which demonstrates or shows that people in Lebanon are still very much opposed to Israel. They see it as the biggest threat in the region, and the US as the biggest threat in the region and the world. 97% of Lebanese, according to this poll, said that Israeli policies threaten the security and stability of the region. 88% of respondents said that that US policies are also a threat to the region. 85% described the security situation in Lebanon as bad or very bad. They obviously, majority of people say that the economic situation is bad, and on and on and on, political situation. But what's most important is 89% of people oppose the recognition of Israel as a state. So that's 89%. That's still the vast majority of the country. So when we talk about this conversation about normalization, it also represents a minority view, a very minority view. They just happen to have access and control over the media, and they have the biggest megaphones in the Western press as well, because these are the people that are elevated by US imperialism.
Of course, those are the voices they want to listen to, which is how this, of course, Cuba and Venezuela, and we see the same thing, or Iran or anything. It's like, which voices are you actually selectively platforming? Who do you want to listen to? I love that you're saying this, because on the one hand, you're mapping out an entire project of counterinsurgency that has been happening for a long time. And Lebanon has been at the heart of this in the context of our region, so-called Middle East, right? Because it's a soft entry point to empire. There's a way in which the long project of exceptionalism in Lebanon, and as Lebanese, we need to say this, and we have to say this, that this has been the project of conscription of Lebanese folks. Obviously, I don't think it has worked across the board, but part of what you're saying is like, we need to be attentive to what is fronted as the overall idea or sort of framework in Lebanon versus the reality on the ground, which is, I think, where we're at psychologically with this sort of, again, propagandizing and psychological warfare, is having us believe somehow that what's on the ground is not what's on the ground. The larger, and that goes in terms of the global majority. I think there's a way in which I've been hearing more and more people, you're talking to about exhaustion, you're talking about people being fed up. Those are real material things. I understand that. And moving off course of like, who's to blame for this? What creates the condition that a blast like Lebanon can happen? And something like I read the other day, 220% inflation, right? And that still doesn't get resolved. Like, people are still only allowed to take out $300 a month from the banks. Nothing has happened. So, but I think what I want to put a fine point on is what you're saying is that if we are disciplined enough to kind of look at what it looks like on the ground and what people's sentiment actually is, it does fly in the face. And this is the sort of larger connection between the places of upheaval that we're seeing wherever empire, insists on its aggression and violence, which is everywhere, is that people on the ground have a very different feeling than what we are being fed constantly. Like, oh, they hate their leaders or whatever the case is. Like, that doesn't mean people don't have issues. Everywhere in the world they have issues. Only fucking racists think that those of us in the global South don't have issues, right? Or don't have like a sophisticated way of thinking about all the moving pieces of governance. But I really love that you're just like, take a moment here and look at what it actually looks like on the ground, even when it has to do with the resistance and with Hezbollah.
Yeah, absolutely. And to speak to what you're talking about with on the ground, I just want to point out some numbers that are really important and clarifying, because there's a reason people still hate Israel. Obviously, because, it's committing genocide in Gaza, it's destructive across the region and across the world. It's a settler colony and, just everyday crime after crime after crime. But those crimes are happening here. So since this supposed ceasefire end of November 2024 in Lebanon, the Israelis have killed more than 370 people in Lebanon. I'm not even talking about Gaza. Since the ceasefire in Gaza in October 2025, the Israelis have killed almost 600 Palestinians in Gaza. So these aren't ceasefires. Obviously, you and I know this, but these numbers are worth emphasizing because it becomes so normalized, the violence, I think, in our minds, which you and I have talked about before, that we forget how insane it is. That there is still a war on Lebanon happening as we speak. Every single day, the Israelis are bombing. Every single day, they violate the ceasefire. And it's only one-sided. Lebanon is not violating the ceasefire. It's just the Israelis. The United Nations has reported that there have been more than 10,000 air and ground attacks in the year since the Israelis agreed to halt hostilities against Lebanon. 10,000. And I think that's a bit of an outdated number, by the way. It's probably even higher now. And on top of that, you have the Lebanese have actually filed, because all they can do now is file complaints, the Lebanese government. They don't know how to do anything else. But they did file a complaint with the UN last month, urging the UN Security Council to push Israel to end its attacks. The complaint said that Israel has violated Lebanon's sovereignty at least 2,036 times in the last 3 months of 2025 alone. Like, we're talking, I mean, they just killed people this week. The Israelis bombed just yesterday and killed people. It's happening all the time. So, of course, the population of Lebanon, maybe some people, people with like pro-US and, fascist sentiments are like, yeah, we love Israel because we're just like them. But most of the country is like, no, you're still bombing and killing us. We hate you. We don't want to make peace with you. And if there are people who are starting to be peeled off, it's because they just have a misguided idea that, you know what, maybe if we just stop fighting, they'll stop killing us, which we know isn't true.
That's never been the issue, because even when there's not fighting, there's been violations, exactly like you're saying. And I think this is, I really kind of, we had Rami Zrei and Munira Khayyat on last week, who are amazing, who are talking about the Jnub, and like that is the centerpiece of the struggle. Of course, we know that the so-called state of Israel is building a wall. They are occupying Lebanon. They were spreading, chemicals that are forever. It was just determined that it's forever chemicals. There's ongoing incursions that are happening, and this is part of the expansionist project. I think you mentioned the word sovereignty, and I think this is the piece that I'd love if you have any sort of insight on, or what you're hearing on the ground, or the analysis of it, because it seems to me like if a country is worried about its sovereignty, like what the fuck is the Lebanese? I mean, I don't even want to get into the Lebanese government. We know what they care about. They care about their sovereign capital. That's it. And it's not capital as in Beirut, as in capital, as in money, as in flow of fucking capital, right? Because that's the thing, is like there are all these low-hanging fruit about sovereignty. But this is a place for me that I cannot talk about this, particularly Lebanon, without talking about anti-Shia racism. And that this is where sectarianism really is dynamic and alive, and it can have a lot of different faces. But I feel like this anti-Shia racism that is at the heart of this, that the receptacle is Hezbollah, the receptacle is the resistance. But in many ways, what's being played out is this sort of like necropolitical class that doesn't give a fuck about sects. We know they're all loving on each other, just like we see in the Epstein files, this entire class of people who pretend they're on different sides of the political spectrum. But really, it's about maintaining their status, their capital, their access, their ability to plunder the world with impunity, which includes people. And I feel like the same thing is like, if you want to, like, even just lip service to fucking sovereignty. We're having, and the other piece of this is, so there's sovereignty of the South for sure. But then I'm also hearing conversations about like Syria annexing Trablus. And that this is like Tripoli for folks who, this is a conversation as well. And at first, of course, my, simple mind is thinking, there's no way the Marni and all that are going to be okay with that in the North. Meanwhile, they like love Jolani. Like, what the fuck is it? Just any insight you have to like kind of organize all these people. And that's why it's what the fucking empire, because it's only empire that like scrambles people's brains to make any of this make sense.
I mean, look, divide and conquer is a thing. And as much as we like to like make fun of the imperial overlords because they are mediocre idiots, there is a very smart strategy of empire, of imperialism to divide and conquer across the global South. And it's worked brilliantly, right? In so many places. And Lebanon is no exception to that, right? So like, as well as I do, the history of Lebanon and the idea of, trying to create this like Maronite state for the French to kind of be the actual like rulers through. And in order to make something like that happen, you do need to foment a lot of sectarian sentiment. I'm not saying none of that is natural to hear. I mean, people hate each other everywhere in many ways for many different reasons. But of course, that is what empire has done brilliantly. Is it's like it goes into these places and it finds, these little slivers of like, oh, these people don't like each other. Let's like let's harp on that harder and make them hate each other even more. So I mean, that's the history of Lebanon, is like it started out anti-Muslim to try to be this Christian state. But of course, much more recently in the last like 30 years, it's been anti-Shia, and more like the last like 20 years, because, it's like after 2006. And I think it's so important to always remember this. Hezbollah obviously ejected the Israelis from South Lebanon in 2000, representing the people of the South, and liberated like Arab land for, I think, the first time we've seen that happen. That was huge, and they were incredibly popular as a result. And then comes 2006, and they give Israel a bloody nose and humiliated them, and the whole region was cheering them on, like a cross sect. I mean, there was even a poll done in Egypt after 2006 that asked them like who their 3 top favorite like people were, and Nasrallah came in like 3rd, and Egypt is a vast majority Sunni country. I think that would be quite unheard of today, and there's a reason for that. After 2006, the U.S. and the Saudis understood how dangerous it was that Hezbollah was so popular, and there's a really good article about this by Seymour Hersh in the New Yorker about how it's a 2007 article. And I always recommend people go check it out. I want to say it's called The Redirection or something along that line. I'm sorry if I got that wrong. I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. But it's basically about how the Saudi intelligence chief and Dick Cheney collaborated to basically embark on a anti-Shia propaganda campaign across the region for the sole purpose of turning the region against Hezbollah and against Iran, because these were seen as like the leaders of the acts of resistance, which is true. I mean, materially speaking, Iran was funding and arming the axis of resistance, and Nasrallah was like the sort of figurehead that was revered across the region for what his organization was able to do to the Israelis. And of course, people watched his speeches and learned a lot from them. I mean, even secular people were like watching those speeches, not for the religious stuff, but because of what he was saying about American empire and about how to deal with Israel, the region. And so this was very successful. All these Gulf-funded media stations went hardcore anti-Shia, like so hardcore. I mean, including Al Jazeera Arabic, by the way. They played a pretty big role in that as well. And this, this also coincided with the U.S. funding, like covertly funding and arming Sunni, like Al-Qaeda type Sunni groups in places like Lebanon and ultimately Syria to basically, attack American enemies. Not the first time the U.S. has done that, by the way. Used, these people they're supposedly at war with, the, Al-Qaeda insurgents, against their own enemies regionally. And that was to be used in Syria against the government of Bashar al-Assad. And then in Lebanon, against, the Shias, against Hezbollah. And also this, this also created huge problems in Iraq and across the region, led to the rise of ISIS, by the way. And on and on and on. But the point is to say that anti-Shia racism, like it's existed. There's a part of it that's existed, but it got so much worse after 2007, 2008, after 2011, especially. And now you have it being what it is today, where like you'll literally in Lebanon, and you know this as well as I do, have people say that Lebanon is occupied by Iran, not by Israel, but by Iran. And what do people don't mean Iranian soldiers? They mean that the Shias in Lebanon are agents of Iran because they're Shia and exist. That's how bad that anti-Shia racism has gotten. And it's very, very sad. And unfortunately, it's, again, divide and conquer.
Which is why it's our responsibility. I mean, I feel like such a responsibility. Certainly when I'm in Lebanon, there's a different type of, candor you get when you're in your own country and you can disrupt these things. But it's why it's important to continue having these sorts of conversations and disrupt this narrative. Certainly to not allow that be the prevailing narrative that happens, to insist that we know where this is coming from and how sectarianism is mobilized in particular moments. Like nobody wants to talk about it because God forbid, but then when it comes to this sort of thing, it's super casual. But I want to go back to this 2006 thing, and maybe this is also our segue into Cuba too, is there's this way in which we know this. Fascists hate to be fucking humiliated and to lose. They do lose always, like you said, like in 2006 they got their ass handed to them. It wasn't just sort of like they got their ass handed to them, and they have gotten their asses handed to them even in Gaza. And that's the thing, it's like all that fucking destruction in the world, and this is really important. I'm not taking away from the horrors that we've seen. And also, I think it's really important to say there are folks that are still fighting. There are militants that are still fighting. And this sort of idea of the settler state as being an invincible one is just it's just bullshit. We know this across the board. Hezbollah taught us that. Qassam brigades have taught us that. But there is this thing about revenge. And this is why if you're seeing, like, we can talk about the revenge in Lebanon, and certainly we see that in the beeper attacks. Like, you fuckers have been planning this for 20 years. The level of like what you're holding on to and how you sort of mobilize this because of 2006, because you cannot let that go. But this is also my segue into Cuba, right? Like we have our dear comrade Alex Aviña, who talks about the ways in which Marco Rubio just can't get over, right? Cuba and the sort of leftist winning. And this is the way that Cubans here in the United States also function through this revengist politics. So I want to talk about both of those, and just think about the ways in which like revenge centers in this, and the way that these fascists use that, and empire uses that. For me, this is very important, one, to name, and two, to also not write that. I always say this, kind of the history that hasn't even happened yet. Like their wins, if you have everything available to you, if you can plan for 20 years to disrupt a shipping process, to like have a front organization, to build your own beepers, to do all of that sort of shit, like that's not a feat of like power to me. That's like straight up, that's like criminal. Criminal. You own all this shit. Like that's not a fair. There's nothing smart about that. Like you own all the pieces, and then you're just like, look how strong we are. And it's like,
yeah, James Bond. We're James Bond. We're James Bond because we blow up kids' faces with like our superior weaponry. Like
exactly.
It actually really bothers me the way it's framed as being something so brilliant. It's like a microcosm of the U.S. because the U.S. spends $1 trillion that we know of every year on the military. Of course, they're going to have weapons that can do an insane amount of destruction. Of course, their military technology, they're like, oh my God, we kidnapped the president of Venezuela. We're so cool and awesome and strong because you have like the best military technology ever. You can basically render this country that you've sanctioned for like the last 10 years, you can basically render their air defenses useless with like the snap of a finger because you spend $1 trillion on your military every year. And they don't have that because you've taken away their oil revenue because you sanctioned them. So like, are you really that proud? It's like a bully just walking around stomping on toddlers and being like, look how strong I am. Like
that is what they do. That is what they say. They kill children and then brag about it.
No, it's so pathetic, but it's also like, yeah, of course you're stronger. And now you have Trump wanting to spend 1.5 trillion. And again, this is just what we know about. Like the US is it has over 1,000 military bases around the world, is sending a second aircraft carrier to go surround Iran, and is like, as if it's like some like dick competition of who's bigger. And it's like, yes, you are bigger because you stole all the money from the world and have it all and have all these nukes. And like, no one is suggesting that anybody has better military technology than you. What's pathetic is that with all of that, you still can't control the world. Like, that's what's kind of sad for you. And they can't because, they're having like a crisis of capitalism, a crisis of imperialism, which is why they're just in overdrive right now. And it's not to diminish how destructive it is. And it's not to say it's like easy to overcome. It's not. I think we're in probably the most dangerous period of humanity ever because there's never been an empire with this much military technology like we see in the year 2026 that has the capability to actually destroy the world. But at the same time, it's like no one should be surprised that the US militarily can basically like destroy everything. I won't even say they can beat everyone because they can't. They can just destroy a lot.
And do all the shit that they project onto everybody else, right? And that's the thing. But I think sometimes when we say these things, it can sound like it's pedantic. But it's really important to repeat this. Like, I'm the repetition queen because of the force of violence that itself repeats, but because also we see that it's meant to make us feel small. It's meant to make us feel like we've already lost. It's meant to make us believe and internalize their might. And that is not a small thing. That internalization is not just to like make us feel bad about ourselves individually. It's meant to take us offline and give up in any hope or future of something else happening. I think the people of Jnub Lebanon obviously teach us a lot about this, but maybe you can also speak to Cuba here and the centrality of that, because this is that sort of strangulation that has been happening for decades. And that is such a good example of like folks who are unwilling to fucking bend, which is why there's so much punishment, right? I think you see this, that anybody who's not bending, anybody who's militant in the face of the aggression of empire, anybody who doesn't get conscripted will be punished, which is why it's difficult, which is why it's hard. And also why these, people in power have these large, grandiose revenge. It's like, I just think about Marco Rubio and like Stephen Miller, that as these like fucking losers who are sitting there like, I'll show you, and have taken 25 years to dream this up. And now they have their fascistic, channel to do everything their asinine, childish fantasies dreamed up, but with the power of an entire empire behind them.
Exactly. No, that's what makes them frightening, right? Not because they're particularly smart themselves. It's just they're evil. They're evil babies. They're evil man babies who have, like you said, the power of empire behind them. And I mean, with in particular to Marco Rubio, I mean, what's amazing about him is he acts like his family was like victimized by Fidel Castro, but actually his family, his father, I think, or grandfather, one of them, fled Batista, who was the US-backed dictator of Cuba that was overthrown by the socialist Cuban Revolution. And then his family, I believe, was able to visit after that a few times. So he's dreamed up this revenge fantasy based on nothing that actually happened to him or his family, which is incredible. He's just a white supremacist Nazi asshole who wants to destroy Cuba because he hates socialism. That's Cuba's biggest crime, right? Not just that they expelled the U.S., which was basically like in Cuba, holding up a client regime that had like slave plantations as well as like a mafia. Not just because of that, but also because not only did they dare to have a people's revolution, it was a socialist revolution that tried to basically like, forge a path independent of American interests and in the interests of the people of that country by funding universal access to schools and healthcare and all the beautiful things that socialism does. That's what he's upset about. And it's been a leader of the left in the region of Latin America since then. And that's what he's upset about too. He understands that if you take out the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, and if you take out the revolution in Cuba, then you basically like annihilate the left across the region because they are the leaders of that, right? But this blockade on Cuba, like you said, has been it's existed since 1959, 1960, right? Cuba's been under U.S. blockade. There's a State Department memo from 1960 that clarifies explicitly that blockade is for the purposes of immiserating the people of Cuba so much that they rise up and overthrow their government so the U.S. doesn't have to do it. And that is the point of sanctions till this day. But Cuba, despite really, really hard times, has managed to persevere. However, I would say that today is definitely a crisis for Cuba. It's one of the hardest times it's going through because the US has gone beyond that blockade and even the horrific sanctions they've had in place in just the last few years under Trump and then Biden and then now Trump again. Trump has put in place this essential policy of terrorism against the Cuban people by threatening any country that sells Cuba fuel with tariffs. So this is essentially depriving this tiny island nation that is literally 90 miles away from the US of oil. Cuba produces only about 40% of its energy needs because it's a tiny island. That's all it can produce, right? So that other 60% that it needs to import is really, really important. And they have not received any fuel from outside since December. So Cuba has been cut off from oil since December, and fuel is so important. Energy is so important. Like I live in Lebanon where, there's been moments of crisis where there's no energy coming into the country or very little. And so we don't get to have electricity. What happens when you don't have fuel? You're not just sitting in the dark. You can't turn your refrigerator on to refrigerate food. Food spoils. You can't put gasoline in your car to go anywhere. You can't move. You can't distribute food across a country if you can't put gasoline in trucks to move, the food that's grown on a farm to like an area so people can buy it and then eat it and feed their kids. Like it's a disaster. Not to mention, like sometimes I think about these people, these elites in the US who like imagine if they went like, a day or, imagine if they went 6 months. 6 months. They can't get their Botox. They can't get their nails done. They can't blow dry their hair. Like imagine they would lose their shit. They would start a revolution just for those things that they're those luxuries in life that they're used to. And then take it a step further and imagine you can't go to school. You can't like cook. You have no cooking gas. You can't like literally cook food. It's a horrifying what happens. Hospitals depend on fuel to run. There's certain things that need to run 24 hours a day. Somebody's like on life support, for example, or in the ICU and they need a breathing machine and you've taken away their ability to now like run all those. It's so vicious and evil what's being done to Cuba right now. And, the cruelty is the point because, Trump has admitted, I'm sure you see this video going around, that they're like basically intentionally causing a humanitarian crisis. And what's really sad about this too is that the world is letting it happen. Like everybody's bending the knee to this US bullying, including regional powers, because they're so scared of tariffs. But, that might be the way to go in the short term if you don't want your country to be in the crosshairs of the US. But in the long term, all of these countries that are capitulating to the US, to the Israelis, whether we're talking about Gaza, whether we're talking about Lebanon, or whether we're talking about Venezuela and Cuba, they are helping a fascist empire bulldoze over everyone's sovereignty because it doesn't stop at Gaza and it doesn't stop at Cuba. Like it's going to continue. An empire like the US will never be satiated until everyone is their slave. So I think it's a huge miscalculation for, look, I'm not the leader of Mexico, so maybe it's easier for me to say, but I think it's a big miscalculation to bow down to Trump and to stop sending oil to Cuba. Because eventually Mexico is already in the crosshairs. Brazil, like where the hell is Brazil? Like Russia and China, I'm not saying that these people have to come save the world. However, like where are you? Like you're just gonna let the US starve? It doesn't stop there. Like you are next. Yeah. And unfortunately, we live in a world right now where I don't know. It's just a world of cowardice. It's very sad. Right. And I guess this is where people's movements need to step up because.
It's outright black. This is the thing of like coercing leaders or anything into positions, outright blackmail. But one of the things you're saying is like, it doesn't fucking work. Number one, it doesn't work because they're vampiric and expansionism is never done. Right. And it is full submission. I've said this before about like Zionism or anything like that. It's like, it's all these ways in which we pretzel ourselves to soften, to do the thing. Nothing short of submission is going to work when you're up against fascist. It's a totalizing process, ideological process. You don't get to do ideology light. They're not just they want full submission to it, but they're also fucking lying. Like this is part of it. It's like what you brought up, the ceasefire, any one of these things. There's also this insistence that if you do these things, we actually will be nicer or better. But we see that actually they never follow through on that, because that's not the point. Like you were saying before with Marco Rubio, it's about being anti-communist. It's about being anti-resistance. It's about making sure that can't happen. So I actually don't think it's hyperbolic when we say that this approach to Cuba, for example, is genocidal. Right? Because, and I so appreciate that you're sort of bringing down to the granular detail of what it means to not have fuel and power, right? Like power as in electricity power, and also power, because I think that's the point. I think sometimes when people don't live in places that have experienced that it's sometimes hard to even imagine what it means on an everyday basis to do this. And I oftentimes will like explain to folks, like being in Lebanon and having 14 hours without power, without electricity. Yeah. And what that means also psychically, psychologically, and affectively when your whole life is configured around the 2 hours maybe that you might get that, let alone, by the way, the black market that then is created. Like people might not know this, but Lebanon, for example, and I imagine other places that are also under certain constrictions like this that are not organic, but created by the violence of empire and capitalism, is that there's an entire mafia of generator people who have electricity generators.
Shout out to my neighborhood mafia guy.
Exactly. Who sell this. But here's the thing. It's not about these folks it's not about these folks figuring out ways to fucking do this. What ends up happening then is that even when you, like Lebanon, even when you have money to fix the grid, these people have so much power now, political power, that you don't fix the grid because these fuckers will, sort of interfere. I'm not saying that's what's happening on the ground in Cuba, but what I'm saying is like the daily indignities that people are subjected to. And I think this is the piece of like being anti-imperialist, is to say, I kind of have no patience more. I don't give a fuck what you think about people's government, quote unquote. You are prescribing a death sentence to an entire people when you beat the war drum. And there is no nuance to this when it comes to empire because of its totalizing force. Like we cannot it's so unethical and irresponsible to be taking any position that's not wholeheartedly anti-imperialist in this moment, to demand that to lift sanctions, to lift the siege. That needs to be that's a non-negotiable starting point. There is no compromises we need to be making up front. Like we've done all those fucking compromises. You're saying it's been decades. Those compromises have already been made.
Just leave people alone, man. Like I've been to Cuba. Have you been to Cuba? I feel like we've had a conversation about this before, but I can't remember if you've been or not.
I have not, unfortunately.
So I've had the opportunity of going to Cuba a few times, and it is like, it's such a, I mean, obviously like everywhere is beautiful. I'm not going to say, like any place is ugly, but Cuba is just so special because you have people who are like ideologically just driven to training medical workers to go like serve as doctors around. They're the biggest exporter of doctors around the world. That's how amazing Cuba is. They have this beautiful socialist project that seeks to actually like take care of people in a way that we can't even comprehend in the US because we're just like so hyper capitalist, practically like libertarian. In the way we deal with social services. And it's like, you go to New York and you're just like walking over homeless people. Cuba just has a very different way of like looking at humanity. And it's like, God, these monsters, you're just trying to kill people here. And for what? Because you can't stand like one tiny island having control over how it like exists in the world, because that's what it's about. But I would even broaden out what you're saying to include Iran. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say Iran system is so beautiful and it's like my ideal paradise or anything like that. But I do believe as people who have who live in the belly of the beast, who benefit from whatever you get from living in the belly of the beast or having an American passport, first and foremost, we should be adamantly opposed to all the horrific shit our country is doing to this country of 80, 90 million people. Iran is a country of 90 million people, and the US has been economically strangling it on purpose for the same reasons it's strangling Cuba, to try to foment people's anger against the government so they'll overthrow it so America doesn't have to, and literally killing people as a result. And you had these protests in Iran recently, and suddenly everybody forgot that they should be opposed to sanctions. I'm not saying you have to love everything the Iranian government does. No one's saying that. I'm certainly not. But dude, first and foremost, anti-imperialism has to be at the heart of anybody who claims to be on the pro-Palestine left. Has to be at the heart of anything you say about any other country, because I'm just so sick of the moralizing. America is the most destructive, dangerous, and violent country in the world, and murders people en masse every single day with its economic and military policies on purpose, so that they can continue to hoard wealth for this tiny elite that doesn't even benefit most people anyway. And they also, by the way, rape people and sex trafficking rings too.
Exactly.
That's what you see. It's run by a criminal enterprise of pedophiles as well. And so that is the most dangerous thing in the world before anything else. And nobody can breathe as long as American empire exists.
Yes. What the fucking empire? That's why. No, but you're absolutely right, and that needs to be the departure point of everything. There's something really interesting that you've probably noticed this too, is that, and you said this earlier about Hezbollah or Lebanon, the fascists in Lebanon, or even non-fascists. Just there's no pretense anymore. There's no diplomacy. There's nothing. There are many of us who have lived in a separate world anyway in the global south, where that never existed. That was never the world that we lived in. The world of law and order did not belong to us. But there's something so deeply interesting to me, and I wonder if you have anything, any thoughts about this, of outwardly admitting this. You have state representatives from the United States saying, this is what we did in Iran. We crashed the currency. I mean, just outright, right? We crashed the currency. We did this. We made sure to do this. Here's how we used Starlink. Here's how we had everybody there. Hey, Mossad agent, nice to see you in the street, right?
Literally.
Just straight up saying this stuff. The settler state also saying, the settler state always says that. And I've said this before. It's they think nobody understands Hebrew. So they're just saying all the shit when the world understands what the fuck you're saying. But it's good intel for us about what's actually happening, because they're brazen in their truth telling about the criminality that they engage in, just like their soldiers, their genocidal soldiers. And so that's Iran. And then the same thing about Cuba. When you see Marco Rubio sort of the other day giving this white supremacist colonial speech about the might of the, how we've now come back to it. It's about coming back to colonialism and white supremacy, and we've lost our way. Carney did the same version of this. And yet, to speak to the so-called leftists of the world, there's all these ways in which everything is being said out loud, and people are reaching to somewhere else. It's almost like it's so in your face that they can't wrap their mind around the fact that this is truly what is happening. This is what I see from the Epstein files too, is sort of nobody's talking about the ways in which they've just handed us a blueprint that, by the way, commies and everybody who's ever had a political analysis about anti-imperialism has been saying forever, right?
Yeah.
But there's this reach to go somewhere else. And what do you think of that? What is happening in conversations that you've been having? I mean, I've been having this conversation a lot to people where I'm what is this impulse to disavow when somebody your supposed enemy is literally telling you, yeah, that's what I'm doing. And then you go somewhere else.
It's just this idea that oh, Trump and Marco Rubio and Stephen Miller are a deviation or something from like American policy is bad, but it's not this bad. They're just like extra. They're like an exception. And it's like, no, this is like the logical endpoint of a bipartisan policy of maintaining US hegemony around the world. And yeah, maybe under like Obama or a future president AOC, it will look a little different, but like, you know, the ultimate end goal is the same, and that is complete American domination and hegemony over the entire world. And so I think that like I think that when it comes to the sort of like I think when it comes to what we've seen over the last couple of years, there's a lot of new people who've sort of entered our spaces through Palestine. And I think it's great. They've learned since genocide a lot about how bad US policy is, how bad Israel is. But I do think there's something else happening that I find very bothersome. And I actually would love to get your take on this, because I find myself trying to articulate it in the right way without like alienating people. Is there is this concerted effort to try to, like, even to what I'm speaking to try to frame what's happening in Gaza and what the US does in supporting Israel as somehow like an anti-American policy and an Israel first policy. And this is something being mostly promoted by people, figures in the far right, like your Tucker Carlsons and your Candace Owens and your Steve Bannons. It's like, we should be America first, not Israel first. And like, yeah, like I'm glad that you're calling it a genocide in Gaza. I guess I'm glad you're opposed to that and telling your bajillion followers that it's bad. But at the same time, like, what's the benefit of that if you're actually miseducating them? Because in fact, America supports Israel because Israel helps America dominate the Middle East. Like, Israel is an American tool for domination. And if you don't recognize and understand that, then you're actually not going to understand how to fix it. You're not going to understand who the enemy is. And you're basically just letting US imperialism off the hook. So like, there's this attitude like, oh, the CIA is great. It's the Mossad that has wrecked it. It's like, what? And you have people saying shit like that, even in progressive spaces. And I'm just like, and I think it kind of speaks to what you're speaking to. It's like a desire to like, well, yeah, the US does bad things. You don't want to understand US empire is the ultimate evil. And so then when the Iran protests happen, it's like, despite all of the evidence in front of you, where the Israelis are literally like, right on, guys, because we're actually there on the ground. It's like, wait a second. You're like not even going to look at that and understand there's some nuance to be had here. And like, it shouldn't just be like rah State Department and whatever these like random Zionist right-wing Iranian diaspora people say. Like, there's so many charlatans out there. And I want to go back to the Tucker Candace point again, because this is the Steve Bannon model of things. The Steve Bannon idea back in 2016, after Bernie Sanders lost the Democratic primary, was we as the far right, like as the MAGA people, need to basically co-opt the disgruntled Bernie Sanders supporter and turn them into MAGA. And that's really smart. And that's what fascists do, by the way. They take these like people who might lean left and the actual grievances they have, and they try to pull them into fascism with reactionary politics that do exactly what they're doing, which is like blame immigrants for everything, support ICE shooting people in the streets, and like support American aggression in many, many places. And so that's what worries me about like the idea that we should be propping up someone like Tucker Carlson is like, are we using him or is he using us? Because if he has millions of viewers and then people who lean left are going to watch him over the Israel stuff, well, then aren't they just going to end up staying for the xenophobic racist stuff? Because in between doing anti-Israel segments, Tucker Carlson is also doing segments that tell us that Somali Americans are actually destroying culture in America. So it's really, really good that they went into Minnesota so they could deal with all that Somali fraud, which was all just like a racist slander of the Somali community in Minnesota. But he was supporting that. And you have him going in and saying, all this like homophobic stuff. And then you have like all these MAGA people who claim to hate Israel, then still supporting what the US did in Venezuela, for example, like Nick Fuentes, who everyone's like, oh, that's great, he's talking against Israel, even though he's a total anti-Semite. But then he was like thrilled about the kidnapping of Maduro, as was like 97% of MAGA voters. These people are not your friends.
No.
At the end of the day, and I know I've gone on a whole tangent here, but like, I find this very frustrating. I'd love to hear your take.
Yes. No, it's not a tangent. It's a conversation I always have and push up against They are not that, and that's the bottom line. They are not our friends. There's a history to this that I think is really important, particularly in the Arab and Arab American community in the United States. And I think it's something that we can't fall into, of like, people are so used to crumbs that the second they see somebody take up, they sort of rush to it. And I'm not excusing that. I'm just like, that we need to be disciplined about following, number one, what you're saying. Like Tucker Carlson's doing this, and then there's a photo of him at the White House. Stop being fucking fooled by this shit, right? And I think you said something about like, what's the point of Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens or all of this doing this when they miseducate people or misinform? I don't think it's misinformation. I think they're indoctrinating people into jingoism and American imperialism. And that's the point. Like, we need to divest from anything that doesn't go the full way of disrupting colonialism, imperialism, the military industrial complex, and as Fanon would say, strike at the heart of colonialism. These fuckers are never going to be that for us, right? They're never going to say that, because they actually believe in the quote unquote American project. And I'm saying that on purpose, not just the US project. They believe in dominance. They believe in, the genocide that started the settler colony of the United States, and they continue those policies. They are racist at their core. They're homophobic, transphobic, all the things. Of course they would be. They're patriarchal. Like Candace Owens is a trad Catholic. None of this is supportive of our side. And I think there's something we need to interrogate. The second we feel like somebody is somewhat on our side, that there's this like libidinal investment in them as heroic, as doing something brave. There's nothing fucking brave about this, right?
They're millionaires.
Of course.
Money.
They don't, exactly. They're making money off of this. They're losing nothing. And I think this is the part that I is really important, is that when we are engaging in true anti-imperialist thought work, discourse, knowledge production, there's risk that's involved. And I want folks to sort of think like, these people are risking nothing. The fact that it took them this long to jump on board is pause enough for us to be like, why right now? And how is this just another thing that you're commodifying? And how are you speaking out of two sides of your mouth? And what is our commitment, by the way, to liberation? This is not just about some fucking asshole saying the word Palestine. It's about liberating Palestine, which means disrupting and dismantling the ideological conditions that create the possibility for a settler colony, a Zionist settler colony, to exist. That's not what any of these people are doing. And I think this is what I mean about the repetition. Like, it can feel like common sense to us, but the reason why I don't think it's a tangent is because you and I have heard this enough times and have probably fought enough people on this to be like, this can never be what we commit to. Because at the end, and for me, it is about, like, my field will always be like, you can't split, and there needs to be like the psychology parallel to the meme about like, there two sides can be true, or two things can be true, or nuance, is that psychology will mobilize these ideas about like, if you split, like if you take a black and white position, that you're missing something, that you're not sophisticated psychologically enough to hold all pieces. And I'm like, there is no nuance to imperial violence. You're either fucking against it or you're not. That's not saying what comes after or what people do, but like, that's the first line. You got to take a position, and it has to be an anti-imperial one.
I had a debate. I 100% agree with everything you're saying. And I had a debate with someone recently who was like insistent, but you have to meet people where they're at. And I'm like, yeah, people. Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens aren't people. They're like influential like leader types who are misdirecting people into fascism. They're not, that's not yes, you want to meet the masses of people where they're at. Sure. I don't expect them to have the perfect take and know everything right away and all that stuff. That's not who I'm talking about here. I'm talking about multimillionaires who are charlatans, who are making money off of this shit. And I'm sorry, like, we always used to say, what was it? Progressive except for Palestine, right? Like all of these people who, support abortion rights and like, support healthcare, universal healthcare, and all these progressive policies and everything except when it comes to Palestine. And I'm hoping that, that's increasingly become a relic of the past, which is fantastic. I also don't want to be regressive except for Palestine, where, like you said, any of that breadcrumbing where you just hear someone shout Palestine and you're like, yes, queen. Like, if that person in the next breath is like saying some like crazy racist, homophobic shit, and that like trans people are extremists who the FBI should be surveilling, like, I'm not throwing those people under the bus, because, like you said, liberation for everyone. And you don't get that if you're gonna align with people who are, again, in the one breath calling Gaza a genocide. And like with Candace Owens in the next breath, she'll start talking about how the biggest victims of World War II were actually Christians killed by the Judeo-Bolsheviks. That's a line she says, like, which is just insane. But like, and also Nazi stuff. Like, that's like Nazi shit right there.
Which is on brand. It's on brand.
Yeah. But like, it's, of course, like, I'm not discounting that, like, it's great to hear people be against genocide in Gaza, even on the right. And I'm glad there's like a little civil war, if you can even call it that, kind of happening in like a corner of the right. But I'm not going to hold those people up. I'm not going to make them my allies. And we should not be looking to them like they're going to fix it all. And that's where our savior is like on the right of American politics. It's right. Just like, open your eyes.
It's a deflection. It's also a part of the larger project of deflection, because here we are sort of focusing on that rather than focusing on the other issues that actually fall in step with everything empire is doing, like the abduction of the president and his wife of a sovereign nation. That it's still, by the way, I think somebody in the chat was like, what the fuck's going on? Like, where we haven't heard anything. Everything's off the radar.
Yesterday's news. It's already yesterday's news. It's like,
exactly.
No one's talking about it anymore.
Which is a clue for us. But like, maybe that's so let's go to Venezuela. Like, what have you been up to? What have you been looking at? What are the things that we need to keep on the radar?
So much has happened already this year, and it's like only middle of February. Like, what? I remember it was like January, like the first week of January it happened January 3rd. They kidnapped President Maduro of Venezuela, a sitting president of a country, on January 3rd. They killed like 100 people in the process. They bombed a bunch of things in Venezuela. They used some like high-tech equipment that was able to cut off Venezuela's communication and like, render the air defenses completely unusable. And it was really horrifying, and it was completely unprecedented. It certainly, pushed the bounds of international law, if that even still exists in any way whatsoever. And I really think I think that without Gaza, you can't have what was done in Venezuela, and you can't have what's being done to Cuba. Gaza really opened the floodgates in such a significant way, because the reaction from the West was so insane. And it was so insane because Gaza was a demonstration of them losing control. You had like the brown natives like rise up and, shoot at what Joseph Farrell called the garden. The jungle people shot at the garden in Gaza, and it freaked out the West, and they responded with a genocide that was not only meant to subdue and steal more land and genocide more Palestinians, but it was meant as a message, I think, to the global South that, like, if you dare point your weapons at us or try to resist us in any way, we will stomp on you. And that is what we've seen the US and its allies do since then. And I mean, you literally, like, I don't think you could have the killing of all those fishermen. It's been over 130 people that the US has murdered in the Caribbean in these fishing boats, claiming they're drug traffickers. It was a big story when it started. And now, again, another crazy crime, war crime that has just like become background noise, along with the genocide in Gaza and the blockade on Cuba and the kidnapping of the sitting president of Venezuela. It's just background noise that's completely dropped off the radar. But just a few days ago, they killed more people, and it's over 130. I don't think you could have had that without Gaza. Now, if that had happened before Gaza, it would have been bigger news. But now it's like, you know, after you starve babies to death in a live stream genocide and like bomb every hospital, nothing really is going to shock the conscience of the world if that hasn't. So all that's to say, with regard to Venezuela, I mean, I've been to Venezuela a bunch of times. I've done a lot of reporting in Venezuela. I was there in 2024 at this point. There was presidential elections in the summer of 2024 that the U.S., of course, refused to recognize because Maduro won. I was there to cover those elections. I watched international observers from dozens of countries around the world come and observe those elections to make sure they went smoothly, and they did. And Maduro won, actually not even by that much, by the way, because sanctions have diminished some support for the Chavista movement in the last decade, as sanctions do. But he still won over the opposition, which the opposition in Venezuela is largely U.S. backed. The opposition that matters is U.S. backed. It's largely right wing. It basically wants to return Venezuela to the days before the Bolivarian Revolution, before Chavez became president, when Venezuela was a very impoverished a country full of impoverished people that had like an oligarchy that ran everything, a land-owning class that made all the oil revenue that was just completely partnered with the U.S. ruling class in Washington. After Chavez came to power, you had the literacy rate go up. You had healthcare the health of the population go up dramatically. The like babies survived birth more often. All the good things went up after Chavez came to power because he didn't nationalize all the country's oil revenue, but he nationalized a portion of it and then used that profit to basically build schools and clinics. Like, for the first time, people in rural areas had access to dentists and access to doctors, which are really, really important things to like have a good quality of life and to live longer. And he, you know, that's how people learn to read. Venezuela's literacy rate shot up to one of the highest rates, I believe, in the region. Everything went up. Even the UN had to recognize that at some point. And as soon as Chavez came to power in the early 2000s, the US tried to overthrow him in a coup in 2002 under George W. Bush, and they never stopped trying to overthrow him after that. Maduro became president after Chavez. They you know, and under Obama, they labeled Cuba a threat to U.S. national security. And they imposed a sanctions regime that got worse and worse every year after that, and devalued the Cuban currency, crashed the economy, all the things that come with sanctions. But Cuba has a strong system of communes, and the Bolivarian Revolution continued to live on and continued to fight for Cuba's sovereignty. Or sorry, Cuba, I'm saying Cuba, I mean Venezuela. But, you know, at this point, Freudian slip, because the U.S. is doing the same shit to all these countries. But Venezuela's project lives on, but of course it's struggled over the last few years. You had, under the first Trump administration, them recognizing Juan Guaido as president. I forgot about that. This guy that nobody had ever elected. It was so insane. There was a protest movement the U.S. backed that was basically just like violent rioters who were fascist, who were like lynching people in the streets, including dark-skinned people, because there's a racist element to the Cuban opposition where they view dark-skinned people as
Venezuelan.
Sorry, I mean, I'm doing it again, but actually, by the way, all of this applies to Cuba. Yes. All of these things apply to Cuba. The U.S. does it. It's like the U.S. does the same shit to both of these countries. The difference is Venezuela is a significantly bigger country and has oil revenue. So since Trump too has taken over, the situation with Venezuela has deteriorated pretty dramatically, beginning with trying to label Venezuela as like a narco trafficking country, which is not true. Venezuela is not one of the nodes in like the drug trafficking of the region, actually, like really at all. They literally made up drug cartels to try to justify the bombings of these boats in the Caribbean, and kind of getting closer and closer to bombing Venezuela. But ultimately, like, we were kind of waiting for them to do something in Venezuela because for the last couple of months of the year, you heard the rhetoric and the surrounding of Venezuela with U.S. military equipment. It got worse and worse and worse until ultimately we had this kidnapping of Maduro that was so shocking in early January. Him and his wife, who they beat up, they killed like 50 people who were guarding Maduro in the process, including dozens of Cubans, because Cubans had basically, now I do mean Cubans, not Venezuelans, for real. Cubans had provided security. The Cubans had provided security for Maduro because these countries were partnered in ideology and like as allies in the region. Since then, Maduro and his wife have been sitting in a jail in New York, where they have been indicted on narco-terrorism charges. The indictment is absurd. The accusations are ridiculous and easily disproven. You almost start to think like there's a chance they won't even win this case in U.S. courts because of how absurd and easily disproven their allegations against Maduro are. And in the meantime, Delcy Rodriguez, who is a committed Chavista who kind of came up in the same part of kind of the same revolutionary circle as Maduro and others, who is vice president, is now acting president of Venezuela. And there has been a campaign by the Trump administration to try to frame her as some sort of collaborator. But all of their accusations have proven to be false. Venezuela, I almost said Cuba again, but Venezuela has a gun. They have a gun to their heads right now. And so they're kind of in a position where they're like negotiating with the US to try to not be destroyed. And actually, some of the things they're negotiating over are the same negotiations that Maduro was having with the US, which is to like let certain US oil companies back in, which Venezuela has wanted. The only reason US oil companies left Venezuela is because the US pulled them out, because they didn't want Venezuela to be able to actually like produce its oil. So, there are negotiations, at the barrel of a gun kind of taking place right now. But Delcy Rodriguez, like I have no reason to believe thus far that she has collaborated in any way against Maduro with the Trump administration, but they really are running like a kind of PSYOP campaign against her. There was recently false accusations that Venezuela sold oil to Israel. I put that in quotes, sorry, by the state that calls itself Israel. Yeah. But that is actually not true. The U.S. has basically confiscated, stolen Cuban or Venezuelan oil and given it to the Israelis. And actually, it was oil that was meant to go to Cuba, because one of the reasons Cuba was able, and I do mean Cuba now, was able to import oil was the oil it was getting from Venezuela. And the U.S. has basically put a stop to that at this point. And it's literally like going around the world confiscating oil, Venezuelan oil and any other oil that is meant for Cuba, which is so insane. That's how much they want to starve the Cubans. But that's basically what's happening with Venezuela right now, where this process with Maduro is going to take time because it's like a legal process, but just completely insane that the rest of the world would along with this.
Right. Well, and it's surface area for PSYOPs, for psychological operations. And that's what, like, this is why it's so important to go through the history. And many of our listeners probably know that. But to repeat this is like, there's no basic knowledge in the face of the violence of empire. Like, we have to continuously historicize and locate and contextualize, because the force of PSYOPs, psychological operations, are so strong that you do see people, number one, out of panic, sort of come out to be like, oh, this must be true, or is this happening? The sort of like the transportation of oil to the state now known as Israel, and to really ground ourselves. Like, I love that you said, I have no reason to believe. And this is the point, is to be like, if our departure point is that psychological operations are being used, I think it has to be a daily practice of us starting there and being like, that is the surest thing we know, that PSYOPs is being used. And from here, then we can sort of piece things together, do our due diligence, look at what we see in front of us. But like, that's the starting point. So one of the things I thought about when you were saying like at the barrel of a gun is, one of the things for my book is I went into the wormhole of counterinsurgency and PSYOPs manuals of the US military. Okay. They're available online. I've said this before. But one of the parts of them are like the tactical manual. Like, I went into the tactical manual to see what is it that they actually use, because I'm looking at it from a technical perspective. Like, part of it is to be like, you fuckers, you psychologists helped in dealing, like putting this into place, right? There's techniques. The first like preamble really talks about the ways in which militants, people who are committed to a cause, and particularly a revolutionary cause, because let's face it, that's who these are used against. They're not going against fascists and right-wing people. They're going against people who are committed to a revolutionary, socialist, communist, revolutionary project. So the first thing they say is that militants, you can't change their mind, because they are so committed and they know and they're clear-eyed. So what you do is you launch misinformation campaigns. You make people hate them. You starve the population so that they're like you were saying about Hezbollah, like everything bad that you are experiencing is because these people are militants, right? So that's part of it. The second part of it that I found fascinating was like, after you've done all of this, you start to threaten people. You threaten them with the lives of their family. You threaten them with death, and they're just like listing this out as like, so that's the point.
Crazy.
Like, they just outright say this. So, and that's the thing, is like psyops starts here. Like, you start to make people doubt themselves, how they relate to themselves, how they relate to others. It's not just about brainwashing. It's about compelling an action within us and rewiring our interiority. So we're just like, hold up, is this actually the project that we're with? And like, are these people really our enemies? So that's number one. And then the follow-up is, oh, by the way, if that also doesn't work, just threaten them with death. So it's, I'm like, Jesus, how is this? And this is why I want to come back to this idea of when we always talk about the failures of revolutions. Like, we're always so invested in all the ways that people have lost, rather than look at, for me, I'm always so committed and so moved by the ways in which, despite that you're up against the most vicious, violent, criminal people in the world, there are still people, whether it's in Venezuela or Cuba or Palestine or Lebanon, that are clear-eyed about who the fucking enemy is.
Yeah.
Despite all of that. But that's the point, is like, so when we end up seeing these compromises that we might see, that's my point about like the departure point. There are psyops happening. What the fuck is happening? And if you just read their manuals, they're telling you what's happening. Psyops doesn't work, kill them.
I mean, it's, to what, that's actually wild. They just label it so openly. But to what you're saying, I mean, my favorite kind of like Westerner, and I mean this obviously very sarcastically, is the kind of person who's like never been a part of anything successful ever, but all they can do is like criticize the failings of like every revolution that's had a moment of success against everything you just talked about, which in and of itself is like an amazing victory. The fact that like the Bolivarian Revolution was able to succeed and do what it did for as long as it did, and I don't, it hasn't failed yet. It's just experiencing like a moment of a bit of retreat. And that's what the negotiating and the compromise is. It's like, sometimes you have to retreat. You can't always be in a offensive position where you're like heading forward to the front line, especially when you're like outgunned. Like, you have to retreat a little bit and like re-strategize. That's how the real world works, and that's how it's always worked. And that's how revolutionaries have had to think before. I mean, Chavez himself talked about, how in the 90s, there was an attempted revolution in the 90s that failed, an attempted uprising. Chavez was a part of it. It failed. He actually went to jail at some point. And there was talk about the need to retreat and re-strategize. Like, that happens. It's kind of like what Hezbollah is doing right now. Doesn't mean they're going to come out successful again. They've had successes, but right now they're in a moment of retreat and re-strategizing because they experienced a bit of a defeat. That's what happened in the real world. So it really is incredible when people can't like recognize that. Like, what do you expect Venezuela to just be like take on the US on its own when there's no like regional alliance whatsoever, like against this empire that was able to like come in and kidnap their president? They have to take a second to retreat, re-strategize, and figure out how best to maneuver through this moment in time, which is a really scary one. Like, right. I'm glad I don't have to make those decisions. That sounds like a really sucky job to have.
Yeah. It's also the long struggle. Like, I think these moments, these timestamps are part of the ways in which these things get, locked inside of us as failures or all of that, which is a colonial timestamp of like time that works in a particular way that is sort of contained in these timestamps that don't include ongoing, right, recalibration. Like, if power recalibrates in front of our eyes, why wouldn't also revolutionary struggle do that? I mean, our comrade and martyr Palestinian revolutionary Bassel al-Araj always talked about that. Like, don't look at time and war in the same way that your enemies do. He was just like, these are battles and strategies, and it's going to look like they're winning. It's going to do that. They are going to run with that too. And like, that's the piece. They are going to run. They will use everything to their advantage. And that's the piece where I'm always warning folks about, like, this commodified despair. Like, there's something really important about us tuning into all the ways affect is being mobilized within us to take us off course of the revolutionary project and our commitments to that. Because if you just give up and you forget, this is a long struggle. Empire job, like, let's go back to Fanon. It's not colonialism is not a thinking machine. It's just invested in its own longevity. So if it's invested in its own longevity, it's going to do all the things it needs to do to make sure that that happens. We don't need to be joining in and doing the work for them in that.
Yeah. And I mean, you think about like history itself. I mean, it's so easy to think that everything was a given, right? It's so easy to think that Algeria, like, defeating the, French colonizers was a given. That wasn't a given in the moment, in the 120 years it took to get there. Slavery, the end of slavery wasn't a given. Like, people fought for it for really, really long, for hundreds of years. There was a transatlantic.
You mean it wasn't one of the presidents that just out of the kindness of his heart just
like,
fucking,
you know what? I feel nice today.
Exactly. I'm just committed to this. It's not all the
like, there's so much, like, it's like the 8-hour workday, which I still think is too long, was not a given, right? Like, people had to fight and die for that, and it wasn't a given that they would even get it. Weekends, like, not like the end of child labor, which hasn't really ended. I'm just talking about in the US, which actually it still exists there, especially for undocumented children.
It hasn't, but undocumented, and for pedophiles.
And for, yes, well, they're like in a different category, I guess. But yes, but like, the institutionalized, let's call it institutionalized child labor. That wasn't a given that was just going to be over one day. It's like all of these things, like, required sacrifice and required a long struggle and lots of battles, some of which were lost and included lots of defeats, because the people who rule are the strongest. They have the most weapons, but they ultimately did lose. And so it's like really, really important that, yes, it's okay. And I mean, I think, given your profession, you can speak to this more than I can, but I think, we all get depressed and a little, hopeless feeling sometimes when we see so many monsters seeming like they're continuing to have victories, while the weak and the oppressed and the revolutionaries seem to be like losing really big, especially right now. But it's not like that's the given. It's not like this is the end. This is a moment in time, and it's a part of a longer struggle that comes with ups and downs. And if we look at it in like such like a narrow way, like, of course we're going to give up, right? People are going to give up, and they're going to, I mean, one thing I noticed that people tend to do is they tend to almost like go inwards and make everything about like how sad they are. And like, everything becomes like an act of therapy. And I'm not saying it's not okay to take care of yourself. Please take care of yourself and take care of your mental health and all those things. But like, it's like, you have to have hope. Like, once they kill the hope, then we've really lost.
Well, yeah, exactly. And every revolutionary teaches us that. No, I mean, this is the point is a political project to derail us from our commitments and the certainty that we will win. I really, truly believe that we will, because we will make it so. Like, this is not just a delusional, like, we will, and then we sit back and just see how things, no, you will, because there are people committed everywhere to their version of a world that doesn't include the monsters on top being the ones who dictate everything. That is a daily commitment. That is a daily political project. That's one we have to keep coming back to. And this is why also being like, yeah, the strongest are strongest, not because they constitutively have like some sort of gene that makes it that, like these white supremacist fucking, assholes say, like somehow something about them is racially superior and therefore they can be that, whether that's Zionists or Europeans or, US people who think they're descendants of that, right? This it is because they have plundered and stolen everything and killed off or tried to kill off every function of revolutionary spirit that has sprung up. But they haven't fucking won. That hasn't happened. I mean, if Tawafan al-Aqsa taught us anything, it's that. If it's people in the street in Venezuela right now, it's that. If it's people in Cuba right now, it's that. It's people in Haiti, it's that. It's telling us, like, no, it's indigenous folks of Turtle Island being like, we actually haven't fucking disappeared. And us joining that is not only a massive disrespect, but it also is a misattunement away from the revolutionary fire that continues.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Absolutely. And I think like it's so important for people to hear that and to really absorb it, because I think that the most powerful tool that they have, like more than anything else, is to try to like basically make people give up. Like it's like once they're enemy, like once the people who are fighting empire give up, then they've won. And I absolutely agree with you. Like I do believe, I think we're both revolutionary optimists in this way. Like I do believe in a certainty of like victory for our side. I just know that you can't sit back and it'd be great. Look, it'd be great if we could just chill and sit back and like watch it happen while we're like eating popcorn. But that's not how it works. Like we all have to kind of contribute in whatever way we can, in whatever capacity we have. And that looks different for everybody, because not everybody is able to do what you do. Not everybody is able to do what I do. Not everybody is able to be on like a front line somewhere. But all that's to say, like, you don't sit back and passively watch. It's like that Howard Zinn quote of like, you can't be neutral on a moving train. The train is moving. And I do believe the majority of people are not, but I don't just believe, I know the majority of people are actually on our side. It's just the question becomes like, how do you organize that in a way that does actually challenge power? And I think right now you see a lot of that happening, like right now in the US, with the way people have risen up against ICE. I think that's huge.
That. Yep.
That's huge.
Exactly.
Like
exactly. And have done for ages, but like it's now, we're seeing it. Rania, I know you have to get going in just a couple minutes. Is there any, I've loved this. I could talk to you forever. Is there anything you want to leave folks with? Is there any last thing that we haven't touched on? I mean, we'll have you back. Of course, you're a hit.
I'm happy. I'm happy to anytime, and I have to have you back on my show as well. We'll just keep interviewing each other back and forth. It'll be great. That would be amazing, actually. But I guess I would leave people with a couple of things. I want to remind everybody, as I always do on all of our programs at Breakthrough News, that you got to support shows like this one, shows like ours at Breakthrough News, and all of this like independent media content by sharing it with everyone you know, because these algorithms are not built to boost us. They are built to suppress us. So just everybody make sure you've liked this and make sure you've shared it with at least one person, at least two people. And yeah, I would just leave people with, make sure you follow Breakthrough News, because we do a lot of really great journalism there. I'm so proud of the team I get to work with, very principled anti-imperialists across the board. And I keep watching Lara. She's amazing. And I can't wait to see you in Lebanon. I hope soon.
Me too. Yatik el-afi. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody. I really appreciate it. Until next time.